Hi, it's Scott Richards, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
That's right. We were just talking off mic about the ongoing conflict in the Mid East. It's so complicated. As soon as you think you have your hands wrapped around it, something in the news is changing, and that's the stuff that we get to consume on the I watch TV, I read the internet side of things, and then also the Ukrainian fight with Russia. And these things, I'm positive, are connected in certain ways. I'm not trying to make a big conspiracy theory, but these things impact each other. And now we have an election that's just happened here in America, where we're going to have a different president who's going to want to shut these things down, at least today. So I don't know. What are your thoughts right now, where we're sitting with this complex, far too long going on war?
We have, when this began, there was kind of an initial ceasefire in November, and a large number of the hostages, over 100, were released during that time, and that fell apart in early December. I believe the expectation at that time was that Hamas thought Israel would negotiate a lot more than it did. And so when it broke down, we end up in a situation where we have Israel has an opportunity to destroy its enemies in response to those awful, horrible, horrible attacks on October 7th that were clearly designed to provoke Israeli over-response. Because, for a time, the deaths of the tragic deaths of Gazan civilians as well from, I hate the word collateral damage, but from, the large-scale munitions that were used in the conflict, with an enormous civilian casualty rate. That would have been intentional for Hamas, because now you see this idea of, Israelis killing civilians. And that garnered a lot of sympathies. We saw protests around the world and so on and so forth. And I'd say that was very much part of the plan, a cruel and calculated plan that was. Mm-hmm. But in the same manner, Israel has now presented an opportunity to destroy Hamas, to challenge Hezbollah, which we always knew was coming, and to challenge Iran, to sort of clean out all of what it perceives as its enemies. But it becomes more complicated because of how the Netanyahu government's held power through its coalition. And that meant that the kind of extreme religious coalition also saw their opportunity for resettlement. I mean, as of today, Smotrich, as the finance minister, was talking about preparing his administration or his department to completely annex the West Bank. So it didn't start off well. So this is kind of a long answer, because this is kind of very detailed and nuanced, and having sort of been involved with the hostage families, been involved in communicating with all of the stakeholders.
Yeah.
Being kind of very, very familiar with everything, is that the first thing that happened was not run like a normal hostage negotiation. Like, none of the things that you do happened. No one established how many people are alive. We still don't know how many people are alive. I knew in March how many were. I don't know now. Nobody created, nobody said, okay, what's the health status of these people? And there weren't lines of communication created. Even if, it's like, we want to return the hostages, yes, that's the critical thing to happen. And I work with some of these families. But the time between now and then, I need to make sure that you're safe. I need to make sure that you're taken care of and that you're in health. To do that, I need to establish baselines. There were no baselines. So there wasn't really a motivation for anyone to conduct this like a professional hostage negotiation at the start, because arguably, at least for a time, for both sides, the conflict was perceived as beneficial. And we see evidence of this with the multitude of failures for the second ceasefire. We see constant sabotage of those terms. We see Israel target Hania, who's probably a more sophisticated element of Hamas, being the political, like the Taliban in Doha, is the political element that are a bit more educated than the ground commanders. And then, so you've killed the lead negotiators. That gets complicated. And so it's been unlike anything else, really, in terms of it. It's a very long answer to a question that
I've got a follow up. Because it's
Good.
this is the complexity of these things, right? All of these parts that are sort of not even tertiary, like quaternary or quintiary, they all have this desire for some kind of an outcome. But you have, and we're just talking Israel and Hamas right now, right? But we have these two foes that, given the chance to fight, these guys were spoiling for it, and it's absolutely a reasonable conclusion to say Israel's not going to stop until it destroys Hamas. That's what we would do. We would go out and kill and I'm talking about the United States. We would try to kill everybody we could, in Al Qaeda, in ISIS, whatever. We'd just go out and just reap for as long as we thought we needed to. We wouldn't stop. So, we maybe wouldn't annex Iraq or whatever, but it's not unreasonable for another country to want to do that. And the other side, Hamas has its own side of things. Gosh, it's crazy, man. They both want the fight so bad. Is there a way to stop it? Okay. Oh, only kind of. Okay, help us understand that.
I mean, so in the early iterations of the Hamas charter, it included the destruction of Israel, and there's no doubt that they see Israel as the foe, and I say kind of for a very acute reason.
Okay.
Is that when this is said it was a 9/11 attack, it's very much that. Very much in the motivations of it, as opposed to being an enormous, shocking event that traumatizes the health of the country. But it was also intended for over-response. And the original Al-Qaeda plan for 9/11 was to unite the Muslim world against the West by seeing, Muslim blood being spilled in Arab lands. And so in that sense, it was very successful in the objectives of isolation. Now, I would have expected that when Hamas triggered this event, they would have expected Hezbollah and Iran and Yemen and the Iraqi militias and the militias in Syria to all rise up with them, and they didn't. Which is good for Israel's survival. Which is good for the greater stability that we hope to see from this. So Hamas's calculation was probably they weren't going to be fighting alone, and then that doesn't happen. And Israel's, the death toll now of civilians is probably about 43,000, and Hamas is maybe 20,000, and the figures in February, though, they killed like 13,000. And so between sort of now and February, that civ-cas ratio is pretty bad. It's 3 civilians to 1 combatant. That's worse than an IED. So it comes to this very, very complicated place. It comes to something that you said is, absolutely Israel has to destroy Hamas so it doesn't pose a threat. And also to not create a situation that creates an endless war.
Right.
And so we need to then ask ourselves, Yahya Sinwar is dead. Haniyeh is dead. Those are the 2 people named in the ICC judgment. They're gone. Hamas has been destroyed and debilitated, now down to sort of small combatant units. Occasionally IEDing a tank or whatever else, not really capable of projecting force of violence. So what's the definition of destroyed? Is the definition of destroyed when some of the figures in the Netanyahu government have come out and said, we want to destroy Hamas, but that includes all of their supporters, anyone who applauded them, and anyone who ever, and I quote, handed them candy. And that's a direct quote. So we now have a massive death toll, a massive injury rate. I've been dealing with medical evacuation from children from Gaza. You're talking 3rd-degree burns, loss of limbs, just horrific injuries on people that have had no part in a conflict. So what does victory look like? If it's not the destruction of Gaza and the removal of UNRWA, turning effectively all of them into refugees, then we can say Hamas is, for all intents and purposes, destroyed because they're willing to hand over power to a civilian technocratic government. And we've known that since September. But that entity would be the West Bank, which is simultaneously being undermined by the finance minister, Smotrich, by withholding their taxes. It's about $2.5 billion they've withheld from West Bank now. And now they're talking about collapsing the international banking system there. And now they're talking about preparing to annex all of West Bank. The West Bank is pivotally important because it is generally when you describe the state of Palestine, with having UN observer status with privileges, you're talking about Ramallah, you're talking about the West Bank. So the only entity that can truly administrate lawfully a day after plan, that could invite the international community for reconstruction, for trade advice assist, is the West Bank. If the West Bank doesn't exist, then you really don't have anything to rebuild from, and you really don't have anything lawfully to work. And then you're going to start to reignite tensions with Egypt. So it becomes much, much, much more dangerous. And then it comes into, creating that, fueling that anti-Semitic sentiment that Israel, which is really, dominated by Netanyahu and his colleagues. Over 70-something% of Israelis want a ceasefire. 62% of them were willing to support the ban on weapons to Israel, because they realize that it's not made Israel safer. It's not made it safer to be Jewish anywhere in the world. So it's not much more complex. There are solutions. There are off-ramps. There are ways to solve this. The Arab world is willing to guarantee Israel's security. And so, a lot of people talk about, how do you disarm Hamas? Good question. How do you get to the point where Hamas will agree to be disarmed?
Right.
That's more the question, because their point for ceasefire has always been, we want IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Now, the IDF's not going to do that if they perceive Hamas as a threat, or if there's not another form of power to take its place to guarantee Hamas doesn't come back. Hamas isn't going to disarm until they feel confident that the extremists within the Israel government, who hold minority seats, Smotrich's party holds 7 and Ben-Gvir holds 6. But the way Israeli politics work is between the two of them. Particularly, around mid-year, they have the capacity to dissolve the government. They could together, but not alone anymore. And so you had this constant appeasement of this extremist wing. So how does Hamas feel comfortable and secure enough that if they disarm, that Israel's not just going to invade the whole thing? I've been living this very intensely for over a year now.
It's crazy because there's so many points to jump in and talk about different aspects of this. And it's just, I don't know how you turn this thing off. And that's terrifying, because that means escalation is always the next thing. We've already escalated, right? We've had multiple countries rocketing and bombing Israel. Israel has started to attack other countries now too. And so it is this very dangerous thing. and it's interesting because the word we use here in our press is we talk about getting a ceasefire, but we wouldn't accept a ceasefire. We would never accept that. We would want different terms. We haven't won a war for a while, but ceasefire, what does that do? And why would Israel accept that if they perceive Hamas as a threat? This goes back into your conundrum, right? So how do you tamp down the extremism on both sides, where, again, like a very small group of people are putting that region, potentially the world, in peril because they won't stop?
I mean, it's always the way that, to kind of put in context, how few people it takes to rule a country when you rule by the gun and rule by fear. At one point, the Talibs were reduced to 5,000. And they managed to build their numbers back up, and, to Hamas being 20, possibly 25, and that might be rolling in PIG and, Al-Qaeda into that as well, into those numbers. Gaza's, you're talking over 1 million people. And a tiny fraction of that has managed to maintain control, and they're not even liked terribly. So, there's some things that, because we're dealing with a live scenario, and very much at the moment we have some of the hostage families in DC. We've been speaking a lot with DC. I've been lucky enough to join some of those calls, congressmen and senators, to try to kind of get the understanding of where we are. But you come back to a few things. First, Israel can argue that this was to a point a defensive war. The destruction of it and whatever else, you can talk about technicalities of international law and reprisal strikes, but you can say it's defensive action. But at a point, at least with Gaza, it becomes it ceases to be defensive when there aren't defensive gains being made, when it becomes punitive. I mean, it's so difficult to get medical in there. And when we're talking, hospitals don't have bandages, let alone band-aids. They don't have, patients are being treated for cancer. Civilians, again, can't get cancer meds. And we have an obligation with, at least, you think, with a Western ally, to at least follow some semblance of the rule of law in conflict. So there are very clear paths. And for Hamas, and I say there's only parts of this I can describe in detail. My view on the short ceasefire was that Hamas should accept it publicly, because although it doesn't bring all the hostages home, one, we show negotiation can take place. The second thing is, we need aid into Gaza. And if Hamas has any sense of duty to the people of Gaza, then increasing aid and trade for hostages and perhaps some prisoners, because that's what they always seem to want, is very productive. And then that can go into or become phase one of the three-phase plan, the May 27th plan. But we didn't get there.
We did not. I'll just baseline it like this. Are we any closer now than we were on October 2023?
We should have been closer after the death of Sinwar. The main objection in sort of September, August, was that Sinwar was the barrier. And then I think it was around September 17th, the pager attack happened. And so that shut all communications down, really, because no one was comfortable communicating. So nobody really heard from any of the parties at that time. And then Yahya Sinwar was killed. But that moment isn't capitalized on. And so when you go to DC and say, well, Sinwar is dead now, and he was what you told us was the reason that there was no ceasefire. So are we going to see it happen? And then the talks sort of begin again, and then the derailing begins again. And obviously then they get the frustration comes out of Qatar, where that's misrepresented, that they kicked Hamas out, which they didn't. Because we've got the election at the same time. We have that talk of the giant Iranian attack before November 5th. It didn't happen. So we're brought to these brinksmanship points, and ceasefire is kept further away. And one of the points that I've made since really the start of this, at the start of my involvement, is the return of hostages and the ceasefire is the same thing. You don't get the hostages back without a ceasefire, and you don't get any kind of peace without a ceasefire. Only once that's gone through its phases can you have some sort of concept of lasting peace. But the longer we leave the hostages in those tunnels, the less of them will come home.
Sure. Yeah.
And if we don't bring those hostages home, we don't really have an off-ramp. We have, Netanyahu's got a number of political crises at this point. But when there's nothing to restrain, and then to say, look, Hamas, let these people die, that can precipitate more endless war. And so the hostages remain central to this. And I always remind that when you take a hostage, it's for a purpose. You take a hostage for the purpose of negotiation. That means there is a negotiation to be had. Otherwise, ISIS executed theirs, because ISIS had no intention of negotiating. They wanted to demonstrate their bloodlust. This is not the same. So are we closer or are we not? Well, nobody really knows whether the Biden administration, until January 20th, is going to really work hard and really work creatively to not have this be the legacy of his administration.
Let's back up and talk about as much as you can. I know you have to protect some of the things that because we're live and we, whatever, it's always harder than we want it to be. The negotiations that are going on, and when you're in the room, when you hear really hard here in our nation on our congressional people. So if there's senators and there's House representatives in these negotiations, from your point of view, are these people that you think are capable? Do they look like leaders? How do you perceive these folks in these very challenging situations?
So you'll be on a room in a sense in a Zoom when talking to DC.
Yeah.
I don't deal directly at the table at Doha or in Cairo. I work and communicate to the stakeholders to understand the issues, to understand the political complexities, to understand what certain parties will be willing to accept or not accept, and then make that matter known to those who need to know it at the time for it to be most beneficial to a positive outcome. There's a lot of confusion, or at least, let's say JRD, for example, Bernie Sanders' bill. When you look at that, you say, oh, he wants to ban weapons to Israel. Not quite. It's mortar shells. It's tank shells. It's JDAMs. It's 6 weapon systems. Now, I would argue that once operations have done the primary air assaults and destruction, once you've killed the majority of Hamas, there is no need to drop an apartment building with 30 people in it. You should be moving to smaller targeted combat operations. You shouldn't be just bombing relentlessly. It shouldn't be necessary if you've done that part properly. And then because of the civilian casualty rate, you could say, well, you can't have those weapons for Gaza. But you can have them to hit Hezbollah in Lebanon because they're rocketing northern Israel. You can have them, you can have your F-15s to go and blow up, Houthi missile sites. You can have them to go and hit, Iranian missile sites. But you can't go dropping JDAMs on Jabalia. Because the Civcas, right? That's the family that's famously in the news with that young boy with his hand outstretched in fire. It's one of the families I'm trying to help evacuate. And it's just he was a computer science kid. And when you get to know the real lives of civilians that suffer in this, and he died that day, his mother died that day, his brother watched them burn to death. His father tried to save them and got 3rd-degree burns. 10-year-old brother got 3rd-degree burns and died. And then about a week later, his sister died. And now there are 3 people left in a family of 7 that have nothing to do with the war. Because these high explosive munitions are used in a small urban area without proper targeting or probably even proper kill chain. I don't know how the idea is doing. I think it's doing kill chain. Right. But the argument with JRD would be, well, you just can't drop these bombs on Gaza anymore because you've shown yourself irresponsible and quite likely and probably committing war crimes. To protect Israel from itself, because nobody wants to see Israel in The Hague. That would be a terrible outcome. But we do recognize that you have active threat from Lebanon, you have active threat from Iraqi militia, you have active threat from Iran. You need the big bombs to hit a hypersonic launch site. You go hit that. Just don't drop it on refugee camps in Gaza.
Boy, that seems to make a whole lot of sense. And this is where this difference between, and you and I are both ground truth people, and you look out what's happening. And these folks who have, and I'm saying these folks, this includes a lot of folks, but who have no culpability coming. You blow up somebody's wedding, oopsie. What are you going to do? Break off some bills and pay someone? Maybe, right? But there's far too much pain and suffering for real folks who couldn't afford their lives before there was a war. They weren't, these weren't highly influential, highly moneyed people. Sure, sometimes, but these are just regular folks who drive trucks, who fix machines, who do things for people. And now they're bearing the brunt of this. And once you wipe out 7 people in a family, or most of the 7 people in the family, and you expose them to the war, you expose them to being refugees, you completely change, maybe even they get repatriated to somewhere else. That hurt is a lifetime hurt.
That's what we're trying to do. It's much harder than it sounds because these people don't have documents. And so you
Sure.
can't get a passport in Gaza. You can only get it from Ramallah.
Yeah.
So that makes that more
Right.
complicated. And then you got to worry
Yeah.
about medical evacuation. Is the person safe to move? People have died at the border waiting to cross. Then you've got to get permission from COGAT, who do give permission. WHO will only do category A, which is also riskier because they're the people who are going to die. But then you've got to have the safety of movement and transport. It's really complicated.
Yeah.
You kind of get it. You get into the human experience of it, and it's also knowing at the same level that actually there's a more tragic story to this, and I did get kind of a little angry about this in social media because there's quite a famous British security commentator who called them dolls. He called this family, he called it fake. They called it Pallywood. And it's just like, Hamas may have faked some stuff, in the past or sometimes during this war, but you can't call every death fake because it looks badly on a side that you favor. We have just war and laws of war for a reason.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if it's your country or an allied country. You break those rules of war, you are committing a crime. And so we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard if we're going to have international law and rule of law. But to see people come out and call real human suffering, real human tragedy, real children, and to call it Pallywood or to call it falsified or to call it propaganda, or it's just grotesque. And I personally read the medical reports. I've personally spoken to their doctors. I've personally spoken to the family. So I know my absolute baseline of fact before I even really started to see what we could try to do. And we're still trying. I've spoken to prime ministers' offices. I've spoken to royal families. I've spoken to whomever and whatever. Because this family has lost so much, and they may be not at immediate risk of death, although infection from third-degree burns is a severe cause of death. For having their lives splashed across our screens, for having their world turned upside down, they deserve a different future. But so there's an inhumanity towards other people's suffering, which is really grotesque. You can't cheer, what we saw in Amsterdam, terrible and awful, and everybody blaming each other. There's no real the intersection of football hooliganism and racism. It's a dangerous setting. But you can't cheer for violence against other people. You can't cheer for death of the Jews. You can't cheer for death of the Gazans. You can't cheer for these things. It's just that's the grotesque inhumanity.
Especially if you're not even part of the groups where it's like if you're here in America and you're cheering, it's even more grotesque because you really have some person in, I don't know, whatever, St. Petersburg, Florida, cheering for that thing. You're so far removed from any of the reality. It is grotesque.
It's that level of inhumanity that takes us to more inhumanity. And that's where we start to get. That's where we get into once we learn to devolve someone, we can devolve any group of people for any reason that we want, which is just leads us to a very dangerous and unpleasant place. Whereas we need to seek out our humanity in order to have peace. We damn well know that we could destroy each other with missiles and bombs. We know there's no real gain in this. We know that nobody's really come better out of a war. After World War II, we realized that we pretty devastated the whole population of humanity. And there are places in Australia that lost all of the males, probably in America as well, because they all went to war and they all died. We know what happens, and we know what happened with the Holocaust. And so we create the Geneva Convention. We create the United Nations to protect ourselves from this. And then the Cold War comes along and then corrodes that. Once it becomes sort of a bipolar world. But if you read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it's a really good document. I mean, it's like the US Constitution is a fantastic document, one of my favorites. United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, one of my other great favorites, because it just bespeaks humanity that learned lessons from loss. And we have to stick to it. We can't compromise.
Who's the authority? I mean, obviously the U.S. is going to back Israel. Yeah. Actually, let me ask a different question. So we have a president-elect, a dude named Donald Trump, and if you believe the headline, he's pointed his finger at Netanyahu and said, "You've got until before January or whatever to get this thing sorted out." Is there any real truth to that? Is he going to do something different? He always claims that he can solve stuff in a day, right? And maybe he can. I hope he
Yeah.
can. But it seems preposterous when and I'm pointing my finger at the news outlets who use his name, a piece of a quote, to make things happen. This isn't justification of Donald Trump and his behavior, but the newspapers, and I'm saying newspapers, old time websites, that put these stories out.
I need to speak carefully around that conversation. The context of it would be more to that Donald Trump did not want this conflict on his desk when he takes power. He wants it solved by then. It's not authorization for Netanyahu to finish the job, as some people said. It was that he didn't want to inherit the problem of the previous administration that had failed to solve this problem and did not want to come into office with a war between Israel and Hamas. That's the more precise nature of what actually happened there. But so no, the news does misrepresent, and there are whole elements, massive propaganda machines. I come across these accounts that portray themselves as being open source intelligence on social media. They're not. They're not even close. They're just pure information operation. And so there's this percolation of just controlling narrative, messaging narrative. Everybody's fighting for narrative. I mean, how Hamas and their gruesomeness managed to call themselves freedom fighters and have people on their side for all the absolute atrocities, horrible things that went on October 7th. Very real things that also others called fake. No, that was real human suffering, and these things happened. They really did. Things I don't want to even, really say, because I know a lot of these families. But it was real. And so Hamas came out of the gate with a narrative, and then slowly over the year, they've lost that narrative, and they should never have had that. I will always maintain, even though I talk to an intermediary between groups, it's never an acknowledgement or approval of the methodologies of the groups. The interaction is to facilitate something else for the people that they affect by their actions. You cannot be a terrorist and a freedom fighter, by definition. A freedom fighter will target combatants. A terrorist targets civilians for their political goals. But so this sort of narrative space is a total mess, which, a bit like Ukraine and Russia, it's us or them in terms of polarization. And you could say, well, it's a clear cut, I'm not going to debate that, not meaning to debate the nature of the territorial sovereignty, that the way blocs and alliances work, you're not going to get everybody come around and support the war against Russia that have had relationships. So like you wouldn't get Belarus, for example, to support Ukraine. But this polarization, doesn't help for resolutions, doesn't help for dialogue. But so I don't really exist in these spaces to apologize for anyone or to tolerate anything. I have very specific questions that need to be asked of Hamas, and that's ultimately pointed at Hamas asking themselves who they are. Because if their war of freedom fighting, if that's how they perceive themselves, or if they perceive themselves as jihadists and this is an end times war, if it didn't work, then they're now sacrificing Gazans to no objective. So are you, and more so, that they risk the total loss and total destruction of Palestine. Total thing. So Hamas, your war didn't rise the Arab world up against Israel. They didn't rise all of these anti-Israeli, militias and countries and the Iranians and Hezbollah, and the IDF, obliterated the Hezbollah command in Lebanon. Although they reform, as these groups are capable of doing. If all you ended up with was blood and you lost your land, why not take the other path? Take the path of ceasefire, have the security of Gaza and Palestine guaranteed, maybe you end up with a negotiation at a time that talks about the 67 borders, which pretty much ends all the conflict in the Middle East, because every Arab country will accept the 67 borders. And this goes away, and no one bothers Israel. And then you could give concessions to Israel and say, okay, Israel, you accept this deal. You know, Qatar or the UAE or Saudi will invest $100 billion and build up your city and build up your, you know, everything and whatever you could want. But so Hamas has to ask itself existential questions at this point, given that they could well result in the complete destruction of Palestine. It is possible. In fact, it was said today, I think, by Barak Ravad at a conference that he said, we are more likely to see settlements in Gaza than the return of hostages at this point. That was today he said that. He's right. Then that's a terrifying thought.
It sure is. So when let's go back to information operations, what people often call PSYOPs. PSYOPs is a profession. Information operation is the product. You and I both know this, but that's what we're, just for clarity's sake, for we understand what we're talking about. It is everywhere. Once you know how to see it, which folks like us do, man, it is everywhere. And the way I typically explain it is when you see adjectives in front of a thing, affordable housing, smart diplomacy, that should set your bullshit detector off. Doesn't mean it's bullshit, but that should make you go, wait a second, what's smart diplomacy? You know, and so and politicians are great at that. They'll put very comfortable words in front of their bad idea or their unimplementable idea, whatever it is. Clean things, right? Yeah, green things.
You're absolutely right. They repackage it with an adjective, and it's the same thing, and it's just as unaffordable, just as dumb, and just as polluting as it always was.
Right.
No,
but we gobble it up.
Yeah, we do, and you know, it becomes. I think, you know, when you look at one of the interesting career moves that I made was I started out working for an advisor to our prime minister and the state premiers in Australia, and I was writing for the Senate when I was 25, and I learned to write for government very, very early on, and then I consciously thought to myself, I want to learn how to write for consumers, and then I started working with a branding and design agency and a communications agency that was doing pretty much all of Richard Branson's branding, Virgin Atlantic, Virgin.com, Virgin Media. And so I got a crash course because I wanted to learn the idea of product desire to balance the political communication. But and so you look at advertising as always designed to create an emotional response. And I would say the intelligence and PSYOPs community borrowed from that in the 50s and 60s. Learn from that. Because you're selling an idea. You're selling a promise. Buy this car, be more appealing, improve your status, These are all things designed to set your mind to a direction, which is what an information operation is designed to do.
Exactly right.
And so when the difference between one is to destabilize or change a political direction or to reduce the appeal of an opponent or whatever else. This is all designed to convince you of something or to grab your attention. And it's different with the internet. Like the particular one with the Qatar thing was interesting because it came out and it was on just 12 or 14 different accounts that just pop up in my timeline that I click on sometimes that I don't really follow because I don't like to follow these people, but I like to keep an eye on it. And it was the exact same language. I'm like, oh, this is not organic.
Yeah.
Because if 2 or 3 people have the same information, they will express it differently. It's like when you get a witness statement and every witness statement is the same, word for word in an interrogation or a police interview. And I was like, oh, there's something wrong here. And that's kind of when I got behind it. Yeah, and I was like, because this material affects the venue changes things. Now, Cairo in practice may actually be better than Doha if it were to go that way. If they did kick out Hamas and they went to Iran, it's over. And notwithstanding that Nasrallah was killed, not Nasrallah, Houthis was killed in Tehran.
Mhm.
So Tehran is immediately not a safe venue for, and ordinarily a senior figure would have a degree of immunity that was taking place in a negotiation. You don't kill you don't kill your negotiators. It's not a good faith act. So that was alarming for about, but it was not trusted because of the way it was disseminating, and it was just not true. But it was designed because what actually happened was Qatar had said that they were unsatisfied that Israel and Hamas, both of them, were acting in good faith towards a ceasefire and release of hostages. And that if they continued to stall, that it would be difficult for Qatar to be the host. And that's because Qatar has enormous pressure from Biden, being its key partner in Middle East conflict resolution. I wouldn't call it peace, because we haven't gotten there in very many places. That Biden will be leaning on them, and he'll be saying something to the effect of, "You are meant to be my people, or my guy, my man in the Middle East that gets this done for me. Why can't you do it?"
Yeah.
And we know more or less that was happening, and we know that. I don't know the words that were said, but I know that was what was implied, or what was. Well, I don't know the exact words that were said, but I know that was what was said, sort of July, August.
Yeah.
And so Qatar is in this position where they have to kind of push them along. And if they cease to be host, then implicit that Hamas might lose their status there, which might force Hamas to agree to something or to put forward a proposition that could be agreed to. And I would say that proposition, if it were written, would most likely go to the US first. And then there would be said that the US has seen this proposition from Hamas and thinks it's good, to push Netanyahu from his side. And then you get the other venue, which is Cairo, where Hamas most likely would be safe because Netanyahu couldn't reasonably strike, kill, nor blow them up in Cairo because Sisi and Netanyahu are not friendly to one another, and nor is the GIS friendly to Mossad and the Philadelphia corridor and everything else that comes like that, and the breakdown of the Camp David Accords. All that stuff could light up.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really fall into too many people's interests, but that was designed to Israel to get ahead of that narrative because they didn't want to be co-blamed for failure. It was apparent.
Yeah. Boy, it is. As soon as you think you have your hands wrapped around this problem, man, it gets more and more complex. And the entire time, there's people suffering on the ground, starving, don't have medical aid, can't get away from danger. These are things that I think are universal. We all want people to be able to get out of the way. Why don't we just? Yeah, go ahead.
No, one of the things that doesn't happen, and to be fair, I was guilty of this. Where we started looking at the idea as like, okay, well, you've got this instability in Gaza. The Rafah crossing at that time was still open but closing because the Israeli operations had gone in there, and then the whole thing got difficult. And the Egyptians were very difficult, and it was like, okay, well, what do we do? And one of the things we started looking at the time was Yubam Rafah, which is a good part, which is really back in the conversations right now, because the Palestinian Authority that I was talking to at that time agreed that the EU would be a good choice in Yubam Rafah, which has a mandate to run that crossing, although it did it very badly before. It still has the right and capacity. But then there's we sort of kicked around the idea of an Arab peacekeeping force and get that mobilized into consciousness. Thinking that, an American peacekeeping force or a coalition of Western countries would basically be an IED magnet. It would be a destabilizer, as we've talked about. But an Arab coalition would be less likely to be attacked. The problem is that the Palestinians don't want that.
There you go.
What they want is not that they don't want security, is the Palestinian Authority has an 18,000 person security force. They know they have weaknesses. They know they need to rebuild police stations. They know they need all these things. They know they need training. And they know they need oversight and support to run the crossing because they don't want the corruption. but they would absolutely take a CAT program, combined advisory assistance and training. I don't think anybody asked them that. And I had that conversation. What would you guys accept? And they were like, well, we won't have international forces. We don't want that. There may well be religious reasons for that, because the various haters, the Sunni haters around that say that, this land will be occupied by foreign forces and it's the end times. And that may provoke, in that mindset that, and seeing these foreign forces, or they don't want to become the Palestinian Authority being used as a puppet for the West. That they survived this conflict, and then the peacekeeping force comes in. The Palestinian Authority is there to rubber stamp things. They don't want that either.
Yeah,
but they know they have problems. But they're willing to deal with them. But I don't think anybody ever asked. I may have been one of the first to ever ask. Well, what would you accept?
This is a very common thing. I mean, I've done the same kind of thing on my work, and this won't surprise you, but you just ask, like, what? And I love to ask this question when I go out into the hinterlands and I'm working or doing my job. What's the smallest problem that we could solve today? Well, there's this patch of road over here. It's dirt road, but if we could tamp it down, I'm like, well, I can't tamp it down. But maybe if you went to the government, I'll go and I'll get the army to come, and maybe we'll figure something out. And then bam, all of a sudden there's a guy, and it turns into a bigger thing that I'm able to shape, but legitimately shape and say, look, here's your police force guarding the American contracted Afghan real roller guy who's fixing the dirt road. How did you get this done? Well, I talked to you. Like, no. You talked to your governor. And then when I go back out, I'm painting this picture so people understand. When I go back out a month later and I'm like, how'd that road get fixed? And people are like, oh, we went to see the governor. And I'm like, yes. Or if they go, oh yeah, they talked to you. And I'm like, oh, no. And so you have to go out. This is why they're going to treat this so hard. You have to go out and assess what really happened, And so if we do go back to the 67 borders, and I see this conflict a lot like our abortion conflict here, where neither side is ever going to be satisfied. And so if you say, here's a very fair middle line in abortion, both sides are going to push, trying to get more of their thing. And so that's the ground truth, right? And how do you satisfy those folks? And if you never ask, you never even get to start that conversation when it comes to like bringing peace to the Middle East or whatever. Like, hey, it's two-state solution. All right, who's on board for that? In fact, that's too hard. You got to go way smaller, way more regional, way more local to figure out where the work is, because we think the work is two-state solution to be done with it. It's not.
No, I mean that's so in proviso. And there has some countries I believe have recognized Palestine. And Gaza is West Bank is what ultimately you can recognize as the state of Palestine, but that's under the administrative control of Israel. Gaza is stranger, because although it's Palestinian Authority infrastructure, Hamas have been in power since 2006 when they had their election and never had another one. And so it doesn't fall under Israeli administration, which is why I go back to the UNRWA thing, that Israel can't actually ban UNRWA from Gaza because Israel is not the sovereign or they're in charge of it. They can block them, but they can't ban them. But so then you have to say, okay, well, Hamas agrees to rescind power. And because Gaza is part of the state of Palestine, that it now falls under Ramallah. Ramallah needs to come out of administrative control of Israel. And now we have, at least on paper, a two-state. Constructing it, building it, the technical capacity, all that capacity building stuff that we absolutely cannot turn into contracting culture like we did with Iraq and Afghanistan can begin. We can't insist on trying to shape cultures in our image. It doesn't work. But like you say, the abortion debate's a really good example, because the problem with extremism is the extreme of any left-right group, Christian or jihadist, any Buddhist could be violent, is that the extremists may be 10% of the population. but they are motivated 100% more time than the other 90 who just want to get on with their lives. And so they
Right.
coerce the other 90 and they take control of the movement. That's why extremists always take control of the movement, because they're the most active in it.
Yeah.
And they want to
This is
create
why
control
activists
and create.
are not a good thing. Because activists don't know how
No,
to
they're
win.
not.
Yeah.
No, they don't want you to get on with your life. They want you to live in their image.
Right.
In their image, sorry.
Right. Yeah.
And
well, that's great.
So you need to get away. Yeah, you need to get away from extremism. I had a fascinating conversation with a very experienced figure who's dealt with Afghanistan since the 80s. I won't go into exactly who he is, but he was in the United Nations for, HQ for a number of years, a dear friend. And we were talking about, he was asking me what I see as he's from Central Asia, because we were talking about the joint security effort they need there to protect against the jihad threat. And he's like, well, how do you fix Afghanistan? And I was like, well, if the Talibs were smart, they would have made the South, Jalalabad, Kandahar, and maybe a couple other provinces down south, they're super jihadist Talib world. And then you let the rest of the country be more economically dynamic. So if you want to go and live in Kandahar and have your beard at a set length and everything that they want you to do, then go live there, because the Talibs are incapable of running an economy.
Right.
So what will ultimately, I think, happen, and I said, well, you've really got to look at the northern areas, which are got more borders, more cultural connection. You got Herat next to Iran, Bakshan next to Bakshan Kunduz up near Tajikistan, and so on and so forth. So they'll have diaspora, and so you can build up, economies across borders. People can do business instead of, exporting violence. And then you basically just have to let it collapse. And then you end up at a point where if Afghanistan breaks up parts, one part is the South, which is a proto-narco state, fine. You want to go live there, but you can't trade with it. You can, because you're a narco state. In the North, then you can, where you've got all these, different cultures, Uzbeks, Tajiks, let them define their future. As long as they're going to be accepting of Pashtuns from the South that don't want to live the Talib life. So you kind of have to get to that point. There's no other way out of it. The Talibs have to collapse in their own steam. And if their movement doesn't collapse, then let them go have their little extremist area. But that has to bear the consequences of refusing to be a good international partner. No, reduced airline flights, whatever else, trade, sanctions, you name it. Because you're refusing to be part of the international community, but if you want to, you want to go and be, for them, the desire to be what they believe is perfect Sharia, go for it. As long as you give people choice, then you can make the abortion debate. It's the same thing. Consent, or if you want to go and have, that's where states' rights matter. As long as people can leave, like if you were pregnant through a rape and you banned it in Georgia or wherever they're doing, Missouri, wherever they're doing it at the moment, we're talking about that. As long as that girl is allowed to leave, let her go.
Yeah.
If
one of the challenges in all of this is, there's so many challenges. I shouldn't even say one of them. It's just hard. But whether it's Taliban or Israel or whatever it is, we here in America and primarily in the West, we have this belief of a separation of church and state. That is rare. It's not unique. It's rare. And so we don't even think about the fact that the end times, things, like if we lock those things into place, the eschatologists are all going to be like, oh my God, there's, foreigners in in the Holy Land, and all of a sudden we're going to. So we don't understand that having a Jordanian force in a place that's predominantly Muslim is helpful, because the Jordanians are our friends and they'll help us navigate Islam, even if we're there to teach them about water movement and pumps and cleaning, whatever it's going to be. But we refuse to accept the fact that there's a holy shrine in this town, and that really matters, and that's going to equal these things. And Americans, at least, we're under orders to not enter a mosque. And I'll tell you right now, my job, if someone says, hey, Pete, come to the mosque, I'm going to go into the mosque. I'm their guest. And I'm going to be respectful, like I would in a synagogue, in a tabernacle, in a church, wherever it is. But
Yeah.
we hate the fact that there is not a separation of church and state in a lot of the world.
I don't know if it's so much of a we in America at large. Well, not so at large, it probably is.
Yeah.
Your evangelical community, to have for the evangelical Christians to have the second coming of Christ, Israel needs to be a certain size in terms of its prophecy. The evangelical Christian community is extremely supportive of the evangelical extremist movements in Israel.
Yeah.
So there's an element, and so you're seeing the push, with the abortion debate, that is ultimately an evangelical debate being brought into the decline of the separation of church and state in America.
I've not done it yet, but I want to write an academic paper talking about it's inappropriate to send out, I'll say, Baptist ministers, right? Because they tend to be on the evangelical side. Not picking on any particular sect or anything. I'm just saying, if you go out with your religion in mind to another place to proselytize, or just your point of view is this thing, you are going to be combat ineffective. You're going to be a destabilizer. And so we shouldn't have chaplains out in the field chaplainizing anybody, whether they're Catholics or they're Hindi or whatever they're going to be. They shouldn't be off the camp at a place where they're not trained to be. In general, and you know how hard your job is. We should, at least here in America, we should have a licensing process that allows a military person or a State Department person to know what the fuck they're even doing before they leave the camp and go into that. I mean, it's crazy to say, oh, well, you're a lieutenant, you're 22 years old, you know what you're doing, because you don't.
And the cultural understanding, the different backgrounds. I remember a funny story from one of my soft buddies was in Iraq, and there's this young private or whatever else, and he's like, I found Saddam's missiles. And my guy's like, what? And he goes, yeah, I found them. And it was minarets on a mosque.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, this kid probably hadn't come, probably came from a rural part of America, which is fine. I come from a rural part of Australia, and I've learned from being in the wild. But you're putting these people into a cultural context that don't have any cultural training. And it takes a very long time, particularly in the Islamic world, to understand that. I will always say, I've been with, I've known Afghanistan well, that I would never say I understand it. I always learn more. It's a complicated place. And all of these, because these are all tribal cultures.
Oh, sure.
Yemen's complex. Libya is far more complex with its tribes. And so you need to spend a decade with these people to build the trust, to understand that you can't have a 2-year posting and think you're going to solve anything.
This was one of our big challenges when we went to the Mideast and tried to do things the last 25 years was, like, we're going to show you guys how to do rule of law. Like, excuse me, again, this is my job. Like, hey, by the way, they have rule of law. They dealt with a murder 2 weeks ago. Did you guys know about that? Oh, you didn't know about that. Oh, well, let me tell you, here's the whole story, And then when you make decisions in Afghanistan, we would this is the jirga or, whatever meeting it's going to be with all the Afghans. And I'm like, there's no holy men here. This is not a real meeting. This is a performance of a meeting because we don't like it that they don't. And by the way, when the holy men show up, quite possibly, probably, depending on the part of the country you're in, that's the Taliban. And they hold enough sway. At least where I was, if there wasn't a dude with a white beard, I would look around and be like, and I would ask my interpreter, I'm like, is there anybody from the Taliban here? And he's like, nope, there are no holy men here. Like, okay. And so that was like it's a rule of thumb, right? And when to when you say that to Americans in general, they lose their shit. Can't, because it's the cultural part is very hard to understand. It's uncomfortable, and if you're not uncomfortable in the culture, then you're not learning about it.
Oh, I mean, an example of that, a CI friend was out in a village in Afghanistan, and he knew the village quite well, and that take the State Department person over in for a meeting, and the person that they say is the tribal leader, it was the village idiot. And kind of after the meeting, my buddy was like, "That's not the tribal leader." And he goes, "Yeah, we know." He goes, "You should have seen what we did to the Italians last week." The Afghans were really quite funny. The Talibs had a sense of humor. I mean,
Hmm.
and they did
Yeah.
this kind of thing often because they knew we didn't understand the culture, and they just fucked with with our kind of policy wing, and they would bring the village idiot and call him the elder.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we don't have elder culture in the same way. We don't understand the role of the sheikh as a community leader. We don't understand,
Right.
unless you've lived it and see how the decision making process in the context of their society works. As you say, we come in and we say, well, this is how you codify law, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah. We're going to teach you to be Western. It's like,
Uh-huh.
well,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, maybe
This
there's
is a
things we
big
could
thing,
learn.
man. It's so huge. And this is where I talk about affect being bigger than effect. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you come and you think you've done this thing and you've been clowned by the Taliban because they've got their village idiot out there and we're like, this is a very important person, you become an idiot. You become a joke
Mm-hmm.
because you obviously don't know what's going on. And if that happened in pick wherever you're from, whatever hometown you call hometown, and if some outside element came in and they picked the guy that you thought was the idiot, they're like, this is the guy who's going to lead us to the better places. You wouldn't take that group of people
Yeah.
seriously. You would undermine them. And so that affect changes how
Mm-hmm.
the ground truth is impacting the overall mission. And so how many times does that multiply across all of the provinces in Afghanistan and in
Mm-hmm.
Iraq,
Mm-hmm.
in Ukraine, or whatever it's going to be? We suck at that because we hate to be wrong. But if you're not wrong all the
Yeah.
time, not I always say like the instability, the first law of stability is you have to make mistakes. The second law is
Mm-hmm.
not realizing that you are making mistakes. If you refuse to
Mm-hmm.
make mistakes, you can't figure out
Can't
where
do
to go.
anything. No, but you have to take lessons learned. Do we have a question? I just saw that thing. I don't know when it popped up. And Brad Hutchings.
Oh, from Brad. Yeah. Go ahead.
Whatever happens has to provide safety to both sides of this war thing as an option for at least one side. So that kind of goes back to what the two sides want. And so if we accept that Israel requires security and not to be threatened by its neighbors, and then equally that Israel, if those conditions are met, cannot be a threat to its neighbors, or at least projected in the sense of settlements and the like. So we need to get to a point where it becomes possible to have a transition. And so, one of the things we say, well, when do you disarm Hamas? Well, we need to get to a point where the society in Gaza is reasonably stable and protected enough that Hamas doesn't feel that it needs arms. Because if I was, if you take a concept not such as empathy, or taking not really kind of an empathy, but putting your feet in somebody else's shoes, that if Hamas disarms completely, what's to stop Israel settling all of Gaza?
Right.
So we
No,
need to have those
nothing.
guarantees in place. Nothing. And so that's where we need to get through this point of transition and have a cohesive day after plan, which, there have been discussions in Cairo between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and everybody freaks out about those. But it's, as kind of said before, it's the only entity with any legal authority in order to do that. It's the only entity with enough self-awareness of its own faults that you could potentially build upon that would be acceptable to Palestinian society. And then, the elements of security guarantee that the Jordanians and the others offered, that pretty much all of the Arab world said, we will, if they get the 67 borders, we will protect Israel as well. So yeah, it's complicated, but it's one step at a time. But we need to have forward
Yeah.
steps, not just running on the spot.
Is there an outcome where we separate Iran from this problem? Is that a head of a snake that can be cut off, and we force Iran to knock it off?
Again, I have to choose a little carefully. Uh, there was a plausible movement or awareness in Iran politically after the death of the previous president and the helicopter crash towards modernizing Iran because of an awareness that the Iranian society, as it were in the Mullah society, isn't self-sustaining and it needed to become more participatory and economic in the world. Unfortunately, and so that's what we've seen, across the major events and attacks. Um, at times, the Iranians have appeared restrained. At one point, they just took a ship. Obviously, they've done their big missile attacks, Operation True Promise 1, 2, and now we're still waiting for 3. But none of these really did any damage. But the IRGC, so Iran has been divided internally between the political wings of Iran and the IRGC. The IRGC who wants Israeli blood. The IRGC who was angry about Soleimani's death and wants US blood. And wants to provocate a wider war to get American boots on the ground and spill American blood. But there was a political element, very truthfully, was looking for how much they change. I never bet on these countries as to how far they will evolve, but there was at least an awareness, and it's whether how much of that trajectory has been lost.
Right.
Now, the scenario we could end up in is if we don't get a ceasefire and get more provocation, because the Iranians didn't respond. We've been doing that tit for tat. So you had like the October 1st or 2nd attacks of the 700 ballistics and a couple of hypersonics. And then Israel smashed a number of their production sites, drone sites, their sort of space type targeting sites. And the Iranians didn't respond to that because then Israel would destroy, and even Biden said, I can't control Netanyahu, which is a little kind of frightening to say. Who would destroy their oil infrastructure. So if we come to another provocation, Israel destroys the infrastructure and the nuke sites. Now, if we get Brian Houthis and he comes in then and sanctions Iran with its destroyed oil infrastructure, now we get Iran in free fall. And that may not be pretty. What happens to Baluchistan? What happens in Iraq? Does Iran retaliate with its proxies and launch a hypersonic or a missile at Aramco and blast the world's biggest company in Saudi? So, what is this free fall for 10 years? Who comes up to power in Iran? That's maybe not a great idea. So that's why ceasefire is so important. There's nothing thought about it. As I argue, if I was the IRGC and they smoke my shit, I'd just go and lay sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. Now go and do your trade.
Right. No, absolutely. It's going to be interesting.
So that they have options. We don't want it to be interesting. We're trying to keep it uninteresting.
You want it to be profitable. Have other people live and be able to make money. Man, it's so crazy. Well, look, I've had you for over an hour. I don't want to keep it too long. Please see what you're going to say. Go ahead.
Oh, no. The most important thing for any society, the most important things, once you have safety and security and you don't have oppression, you can have a right to dignity. And right to dignity is attached to things that America does value, like freedom of choice.
Right.
All human beings deserve to have degrees of freedom in how they live their lives, but most importantly, to have a life that is safe. Because if your life isn't safe, you can't plan for a future. You can't plan for a future. You don't invest in a future. Life becomes less valuable. So everybody deserves it. The Iranian people deserve, their government is oppressed and repressed. The right to dignity of their people. They're constantly executing people, protesters, you name it. All you see is trivial crimes. And it's these are the actions of a regime that's afraid of losing power. But it's like that Star Wars thing, where you tighten your grip, more galaxies slip through your fingers. That's what happens to people losing control as they tighten their grip and they lose much more. Anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure as always.
Always, yes. Yeah, let me wrap this up. I'll come right back and say goodbye to everybody else. Look forward to seeing you a whole bunch this week. We got a bunch of shows up on the slate. Always subscribe. Go to PayPal. Kick in some money there. That is an enormous help. All right, everybody. Here comes the pitch video. It's going to say the exact same things I just said. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.